Hello, everybody. My name is Gene Bauer. I'm the president and co-founder of Farm Sanctuary. Thank you very much for joining us today to discuss and hear about our research on PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And this is a topic that has flown through our work actually since the 1980s, when we started doing investigations of factory farms and stockyards and slaughterhouses, and where we witnessed enormous cruelty and abuse. And not only did we feel for the animals, but in some sense, I think, we were traumatized ourselves to observe this. And so rescuing animals from the factory farming industry was good for the animals, but in a sense, it was also healing for us. And I think the same sort of healing continues today at Farm Sanctuary and other sanctuaries, where we have an opportunity to live with animals who get to heal, get to enjoy life, and to begin becoming themselves and expressing themselves and running in the fields and just being who they are without being exploited. So it's a beautiful place, and we're in a position to record and recognize and understand who these animals are. And I'm also extremely happy with our innovative approach at Farm Sanctuary to research, where the animals are willing participants and co-creators in a sense, where we are very mindful of being humble and being respectful and listening and recognizing that there is somebody else there who we are interacting with. And we want to interact in a way that is beneficial to everybody involved. So our research protocols are, I think, very front end here, like leading in terms of a new way to interact with non-human animals, and I'm very grateful for that. But we're, again, very happy for everybody who's here and is tuning in today. Hope you have an amazing experience listening to our researchers talk about the work they're doing. Also, if you want to get involved in supporting this work and everything else we do at Farm Sanctuary, we have opportunities to sponsor Cashew and Liz, and also for your donations to be matched up to $10,000 by Tree Line Cheese, which is a great vegan cheese company. But we also just want people to learn about these issues, be aware of these issues, and be in a position to help educate others and to share this information with others. So thank you all again for tuning in. And now I will throw it over to Lori, who heads up our research programs.
So my name is Lori Torgerson-White. I'm the Senior Director of Research and Sanctuary Animal Welfare here at Farm Sanctuary. Today, we're going to talk to you about a long-term study that we're doing here at Farm Sanctuary that aims to explore whether pigs and cattle are capable of experiencing something akin to PTSD after enduring trauma. But first, I'd like to briefly share a bit about how we do research with the residents at Farm Sanctuary. We're operating under an ethical framework for research with animals that we developed in collaboration with ethicist Dr. Lori Gruen. I don't have time today to discuss this framework in detail, but I want to highlight that all participation in experimental studies is voluntary on the part of the residents. The only time that participants don't volunteer is when the research is observational in nature, so when we're just watching them. Our research must do no harm, which means that we never collect anything invasive like blood, and we even avoid methods that could elicit negative emotions like fear in the residents. Our hope with this framework is that beyond being ethical, it will allow a more accurate view of the cognitive and emotional capacities of animals, because we aren't creating stressful experimental situations that would impact their cognitions or their emotions negatively. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a psychiatric condition experienced by humans who have endured traumatic experiences and has been observed in veterans, breast cancer survivors, and refugees, among others. The DSM-5 is the manual used by psychologists and psychiatrists to diagnose psychological conditions in humans, and it states that in order to be diagnosed with PTSD, the person needs to have experienced or observed one of these three types of trauma. So either actual or threatened death, and so again, they either have experienced a threat to their own life, or they have observed someone else being killed or having a threat to their life. Serious injury, again, either experienced by the individual or observed, and then also sexual violence in that same way. Research demonstrates that other species, including chimps and elephants who have experienced trauma, can also experience something akin to PTSD. And sadly, of course, we know that farmed animals experience the types of trauma that cause PTSD in humans as part of standard industry practices in a factory farm setting. For example, pigtails are usually cut off when the pigs are mere piglets, and cows used for dairy are forcibly impregnated to induce a lactation cycle. For these reasons, we hypothesize that farmed animals are capable of experiencing a psychological condition akin to human PTSD, and we have adapted the methods from humans and from studies of other species to explore this question in new pig and cow residents at both Farm Sanctuary and other collaborating sanctuaries. We believe that if our hypothesis is correct and farmed animals do indeed experience something akin to PTSD after experiencing trauma, that would help us to shed light on an industry that utilizes trauma as part of their so-called care practices, thus opening the public's eyes to the emotional suffering on their dinner plates. This knowledge could be used by the animal protection movement to advance policies that center the emotional needs of animals and make clear to the public the multifaceted, unsustainable nature of the meat industry. We could not do this work without you, our friends and donors. So thank you so much, truly so much, for your ongoing financial support. You're helping us to uncover knowledge about the inner lives of these beautiful beings, and for that, we are forever grateful. Now, I'd like to turn it over to our Senior Manager of Research and Sanctuary Animal Welfare, Sasha Prasad Shrekingast. Sasha is one of our boots on the ground researchers and is going to share more about how we collect the data as part of our PTSD study. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lori. Thank you all for being here today. So it's too early to share results, but I'm really excited to discuss our methodology today. So thus far in the study, we have 6 participants, 2 cattle and 4 pigs. 2 of the pigs you see here, Lizzie and Robbie, are a couple of our participants. For the study, participants are split into 2 groups. So one group that has histories of known trauma and one group that does not have these histories of known trauma. And keep in mind here that, as Lori mentioned earlier, when we say trauma in this context, we mean the individual was exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. It's likely that the individuals in the control group still experience some severe stress, including when they're relocated even to sanctuary. For each participant, we aim to collect 3 different types of data. So first, we solicit caregiver feedback through a survey that's designed to investigate the presence of atypical behaviors that could indicate PTSD or another psychological condition. And second, we attempt to collect saliva samples from each resident because we know that humans experiencing PTSD exhibit an atypical salivary cortisol circadian rhythm. And then finally, we collect behavioral data through videos, and we'll actually go through each of these 3 types of data now in more detail. So we can go to the next slide. So this is an example of our caregiver survey. We adapted our methods from a 2011 study on PTSD in chimpanzees that was written by Hope Ferdojian and colleagues. We looked at the diagnostic criteria for PTSD in adult humans and for children under 6 who are sometimes nonverbal. And we adapted each one into a question that a caregiver could answer for us. So for example, in humans, one criterion for PTSD is, quote, avoidance of or efforts to avoid external reminders, such as people, places, conversations, activities, objects, and situations that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic events, end quote. So given that most of the trauma to farmed animals is caused by humans, we adapted this criterion by asking caregivers, does this resident avoid interactions with humans? Or does the resident startle, retreat, or hide when vehicles are near. And all of our caregivers are given a chance to fill out this survey for new residents after the residents have been at the sanctuary for 1 month. So like all of our methods, participation in salivary or saliva collection is completely voluntary. So the resident has the ability to opt out and walk away at any time. And the way we do this is we have a swab and we offer the swab to the resident and they either choose to directly chew on it, put it in their mouths, or sometimes we just passively collect the drool as it drips from their chins, like Hayes here. And so when someone does choose to participate, we either thank them with a tasty treat, or in Hayes's case, with some chin scratches and snuggles, because that's his favorite reward. The graph here, this shows some of our preliminary salivary cortisol results from Lizzie and Robbie Pig. We'd like to reiterate, we do not think that these two individuals have PTSD. They're both in our control group. So what you can see here is that both pigs exhibit a circadian rhythm in their salivary cortisol levels comparable to the existing literature. So this is exciting and promising because it means that when we come upon a pig who might have PTSD and does seem to have experienced trauma, we can compare their salivary cortisol results to these circadian rhythms. And this physiological measurement could really help support the hypothesis that farmed animals are capable of experiencing PTSD. And with that, I will pass to our ethology research assistant, Jenna, who will discuss our behavior data collection methods.
Thank you, Sasha. So when a new resident comes to Sanctuary, we set up a camera and collect 2 weeks of video during a quarantine period. After they've been released from quarantine, we collect about another 2 weeks, and then another 2 weeks after that, after they've been at Sanctuary for 6 months. We will then code or collect behavioral data from 30-minute videos across each span time. Now, we're interested in how they're generally spending their time. Additionally, we're looking for behaviors such as hypervigilance, aggression, avoidance of humans, self-interest behaviors, and stereotypic behaviors, which are repetitive behaviors that have no apparent purpose. The reason we're interested in these specific behaviors is because they can indicate PTSD or other psychological disorders. In this demonstration, which I'm about to give, you're going to see 2 pigs in our control group, Lizzie and Robbie, as Sasha mentioned, and it's going to be during their quarantine period. Now, we'll be focusing specifically on Lizzie, and she's a lighter, more pale colored pig of the 2. For each video that we code at any point, we have a set list of behaviors that we look for. I mentioned a few of them just before, and we mark those throughout the 30-minute video. But every 30 seconds, we're required to code 3 things if applicable. So 1, primary behavior. What is the primary behavior we're seeing at that 30-second mark exactly? 2, conspecific proximity. How physically close are they to members of their species? And 3, human proximity. This notes if there are humans present within approximately 5 pig lengths, so the body length of 5 pigs, at any point in the previous 30 seconds. As an example of behavioral data collection, I'm going to narrate the behaviors we're observing so you can see what we're really looking for. And alongside the video of Lizzie, there's a recording of how we actively capture those behaviors in the software Zoom Monitor. Now, these behaviors occur very quickly, so my narration and the coding occurring on screen may not fully match up, as I would like to explain what you're really looking at. So without further ado, let's get into our next slide and start a video. As you can see, Lizzie is approaching the fence to interact with humans as Robbie walks off to the side. Now, we would code humans for proximity a little later at the next 30-second mark, but it's good to mentally note now. Now, as you see Lizzie moving around, she's brushing up against that fence. This is a reoccurring behavior called body scratching, and we will code this behavior for as long as it occurs and wait 3 seconds after we believe it stops before marking it as fully ended. While she's scratching, a 30-second marker would have gone off to indicate the need to input the 3 specific codes I mentioned earlier. Now, before that, though, we'll have to go back to her stopping the behavior 1, 2, 3, and therefore we have coded she has stopped the behavior. So there's a lot going on at the same time, as you can tell. So we have 30 seconds to go back and mark those 3 indicators I mentioned. So that would be humans present in close proximity within the last 30 seconds. That's accurate. We would also code Lizzie and Robbie were within 1 body length or less of each other. So we would mark that. And then we would also code the primary behavior as the continuous behavior of body scratching. For the next 30-second mark, we would code the primary behavior as out of view standing, mostly because of that fence that you're seeing. We could see that she was standing, but that fence covers her mouth. And because of that, we can't tell if she's chewing. And the lack of chewing indicates different behaviors. So we want to make sure we're coding correctly. You also may have noticed that she was body scratching for just a quick second there. Those things can occur very quickly as well. So we do our best to code using the 3-second rule, counting 1, 2, 3 after we see a behavior end, and to ensure that that is in fact the end of the behavior before moving on. Now, going back to the 3 codes for the last 30-second mark, we already said that the mouth was out of view, so therefore she was coded as out of view. But we continue the cycle looking at the conspecific relation. So at that point in time, they were about 1 to 5 body lengths from each other. So Lizzie was further away than the last time we coded. And then we see that there weren't any humans in the proximity within the previous 30 seconds to that beep. So then we would have not noted anything regarding humans. This cycle for the 30-minute videos continue every 30 seconds until we've collected all behavioral data for that video, and then continue to do that for additional videos. And once we've compiled all of that data, we analyze it at a later date to see if there's any significant changes in behavior or observations. In this particular video, though, we did not see any behaviors associated with PTSD in this clip. And that's, for example, hypervigilance, human avoidance. We didn't see anything like that. And it's not surprising because Lizzie and Robbie are a part of our control group, and we predict that they'd be less likely to exhibit any of those behaviors. As our sample size grows, we will be better able to compare to members of our control group against the suspected individuals who may or may not have PTSD to see if there is that statistical significance in that comparison. So thank you so much for hanging in on that video. I know things can happen really quick, but with that, we'd like to conclude our presentation and begin our Q&A. What made you think farm animals have PTSD?
So I personally have been interested in PTSD in other animal species for years, maybe 10, 15 years at this point. I've been curious in the past about the potential for PTSD in other captive species. And so when I started working at Farm Sanctuary a few years ago, I was hired to start a research program, and I knew, you know, in my last job, I was actually going into farms and slaughterhouses as part of my work, and so I had seen a lot of the traumas that farmed animals endure as part of, you know, being an animal in animal agriculture. And I knew that those are the types of trauma that could cause PTSD. And so, you know, there's work done in other species on, you know, we talked about elephants and chimps, there's some work in dogs. And it just makes sense to me that, you know, if these other species could have PTSD, or even, you know, some of the work on PTSD, some of the scientific work on PTSD in humans has been based off of animal models, rodent animal models. So, you know, they've done work with mice and rats looking at PTSD. And so if we think mice and rats could be experiencing PTSD, then there's no reason why these animals who are subject to these awful, you know, traumatic experiences as part of the sort of standard practice within industry, there's no reason that they couldn't also experience that, in my opinion. And so we decided to create a study and ask those questions.
Okay. We have another question. Why did you choose to study cows and pigs first?
All right, so I'll take this one. In truth, we were actually interested in studying chickens first. We know that chickens are not protected in the same way that mammals are. So the traumas that they endure, there's a heartbreakingly long list. And we tried, but what we realized is that all of the previous studies did look at mammals and these behaviors in mammals. We figured that since we believe that there is the possibility that any and all farmed animals might have the capacity to experience PTSD, that cows and pigs would be just as valuable of a place to start. And once, we do hope that once we are confident in our methods and that we continue to collect data with some of our pig and cow residents, that we might be able to expand and study other residents of other species as well. So that is, perhaps a little peek into why we approached with pigs and cows to begin with.
Another question is, who constructed / recommended these methods?
So we looked at the research on PTSD in humans. We looked at the research on PTSD in chimps and in elephants, and the animal model research in rodents. And we really just compiled all of those methods together, adapted them for pigs and cows, and tested them. And then we have a research advisory committee. And so they've been really valuable in ensuring that our methods are not only scientifically rigorous, but also that we are abiding by the research ethics guidelines that we created with Dr. Lori Grun that I mentioned earlier. So it's, the same way I think we would do any sort of science is we looked at the other science that has been done and we created the methods in that way.
So I have a question here that I can answer. The question is, what were the 3 stages at which you take measurements? Was one quarantine, and I think one was 6 months. So when we set up video cameras, at least at Farm Sanctuary, we have everybody in a quarantine stage upon their arrival. And during that quarantine stage, we're going to take 2 weeks of video at that time. And then after they've been released from quarantine, we'll collect another 2 weeks of video. And then after they've been at Sanctuary for about 6 months, we will collect another 2 weeks. So that would be the 3 stages.
And if I may just elaborate slightly on the thorough answer, the reason we look at these 3 different stages is because in order for humans to be diagnosed with PTSD, the symptoms must persist for at least 1 month. So that's why we look at the initial 2 weeks and then a month later, 2 additional weeks. And then we didn't really get into it in this presentation, but the reason we look at 6 months later is because we are hopeful that, or one of our hypotheses is that after 6 months at Sanctuary, perhaps those PTSD symptoms have subsided a bit, due to the intuitively known healing power of Sanctuary.
So I have an interesting question here that I don't know if we've discussed before, but the question is, does your team believe that recent air quality issues have impacted cortisol levels in residents?
I mean, I think it's absolutely possible. Cortisol is a measure of stress. It's not always negative stress. So cortisol can also go up if you're excited about something. So it's really important when you are looking at cortisol in other species that you also are looking at behavior. You're pairing it with another measure so that you can better assess what that cortisol is telling us about their experience. All that said, I've never done any research on whether air quality changes cortisol levels in any species, so I can't say for certain whether it might. And the way that we're collecting the cortisol, the salivary cortisol data for the participants in the study, it's not ongoing. It's 3 days of salivary cortisol data collection, and so we won't be able to see if the results have been impacted by the air quality issues, but they're obviously, it's absolutely possible if folks are stressed by that, that could impact the cortisol levels.
So I will say we haven't done any saliva collection since the air quality concerns, so we don't expect to see that as an impact on our results.
Okay, so next question, could stereotypic / repetitive behavior merely be due to boredom?
Yes, I can answer. Absolutely, it could. And that's why I think it's important that we are looking at multiple measures here, because boredom is most definitely a cause of stereotypic behavior in captive animals. You see, I think we've all seen, like in zoos, a polar bear who's pacing back and forth, or a tiger who's pacing back and forth, and that is definitely an indicator, can be an indicator of boredom. They're also, sometimes that's also, it could be an indicator of sort of like anticipatory behavior. If someone knows that they're going to be fed soon, they might do that as well. But if it's consistent and there is no apparent, it's not linked to anything else, then that would be, that could indicate boredom. And so for this study, that's why we are, looking at, like Sasha noted, the duration of symptoms. Is it for greater than 1 month after the trauma? We're looking at what sorts of trauma the individuals have experienced before they came to Farm Sanctuary. We're looking at other behaviors like hypervigilance and increased aggression. We're looking at whether there are any triggers that we can identify that are causing these behaviors to happen, or if the individuals are avoiding, say, humans, because humans often will have been the cause of the trauma to these individuals in the past. And so if there's a high level of human avoidance, then that might indicate PTSD. So there's a broad range of behaviors that we're looking at. And to be totally honest, even once we get through this whole study and we have a large enough sample size and we feel, we've got ideally, numbers in both the control and the experimental group, we never can experience what they experience. Like, we can use science to really give our best educated guess at what they experience. But, when I'm talking about PTSD in other species, I will say things like, something akin to PTSD, because the reality is that we can't, get inside of their heads. And so we can just give our best sort of scientific approximation of what their experience is. And we can say that this is presenting in the same way that, PTSD would present in humans, but we can't necessarily say that they are experiencing PTSD in the same way that humans experience PTSD.
Thank you for that, Lori. So I have 2 questions here that are kind of related, and I'm going to ask both of them. First, how many residents will you be testing, and when after they arrive do you first do the testing? Second, I have here, where did it go here? Do you collect video data on all new residents or just those who will be part of your study?
So we are enrolling all new cattle and pig residents into the study. So when they arrive, as Jenna mentioned, they immediately go into their medically necessary quarantine period. And we do allow for an acclimation period of 48 hours because we recognize that it's stressful to be placed in a completely new environment. And we don't want that to, we want to make sure that that's not skewing or impacting our results in any way. So we do wait for about 48 hours before we start recording. And then we record those 2 weeks of videos from there. Yeah, I don't know if Lori, you want to jump in, if there's any. I know there were lots of facets to that question, and I'm not sure I got them all.
Yeah, I think the other question was maybe how many participants will be in the study, and I think that is honestly still kind of to be determined. We'll keep collecting data for a bit. Right now, we only have 6 participants in the study, so we have 3 pigs and 3 cows. And I think we will keep collecting until we either determine, it seems very unlikely that anyone is going to exhibit symptoms of PTSD, or once we have someone who we feel confident that they have PTSD, I think like there's a possibility that that kind of research could be published as a case study, or those kind of results could be published as a case study, and then we could continue to collect more research. Sorry, someone just walked in. We could continue to collect more data until we get to the point where we feel, we have a statistically significant, enough power in the sample to have statistical significance between the 2 groups.
All right, so here we have to observe elevated salivary cortisol, don't you need to provide a stressor, or is the presence of humans sufficient? I think this is also tying into our ethics as well.
So salivary or cortisol is a stress hormone, but we're actually looking at the circadian rhythms or the patterns of cortisol throughout the day, because in humans and cows and pigs, they do fluctuate just naturally throughout the course of the day. So we're not looking at like cortisol in response to a stressful event. It is against our ethics. We don't induce stress for our research. We want all of the studies to either be purely observational or positive experiences, enriching experiences for the residents. So that we're looking for patterns over the day. So we actually take hourly cortisol or saliva samples over the course of 13 hours for 3 days. That also gives us an opportunity to identify and remove any outliers. But yeah, so we are looking more for like those, the daily patterns of cortisol, because in humans, the humans with PTSD, their cortisol patterns or circadian patterns are different. So we are interested in seeing if similar disruptions are present for cows and pigs.
We have somebody who's interested if other people are doing this type of research, and then someone else is also interested if we've looked at research in zoo animals and their behaviors as it may relate. I have an example here of excessive pacing.
Yeah, so I don't know of anyone else who's doing this specific research in farmed animal species. If there's anyone out there, I would love to talk to you and learn from you. But no, I think, most people who have done research with farmed animals are usually working on improving welfare for production. So they're looking at animals in industry settings. And so of course it would be counterproductive for them to ask the question of whether these animals are experiencing PTSD, I think, in many cases. I mean, there are lots of great scientists out there doing work, genuinely want to improve the lives of animals who are stuck in the system. But I think that's not somewhere they would usually go with their questions. Sorry, what was the second part of that question, Jen?
So it was who might be doing the research, and then what have we done if we've looked at zoo animals and their behaviors, such as excessive pacing? Have we looked at that at all?
Yeah, so I mean, my background in a past life, I was an animal welfare scientist at a zoo. So a lot of my knowledge, my animal welfare sort of expertise started in the zoo world. So that probably informs all of the work I do. With this study in particular, I am not aware of any zoo studies on PTSD specifically. So we haven't looked at that connection there. But a lot of just the work on, animal welfare and stereotypic behaviors and, how to achieve positive welfare for the residents of the sanctuary, like that sort of work is definitely informed by work that came out of the zoo animal welfare field.
I have somebody here asking if other sanctuaries are interested in trying to identify PTSD in their residents. Do you have resources that can be used for, can you recommend resources?
So since this study is still in its infancy, we are still, we haven't proven anything with these methods. So we don't have necessarily resources yet. We're hoping through this work we'll be able to create resources for sanctuaries, but we are actively seeking collaborators on the study. So if you are associated with a sanctuary and this study is of interest to you and you have the capacity to take on new cow or pig residents, we are open to helping set up cameras and having your residents as participants in this work. So let us know if that's something, if you meet those qualifications or know someone who does, we'd love to speak with you.
I have another question here. How does your group use research findings to change policy and the treatment of animals in industrial agriculture? And now that we've stated that we're still in the infancy of this, perhaps we could talk about where we could envision it going as well.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think that, with all of the work we're doing, we're hoping that shedding a light on the inner lives of these species will, change the hearts and minds of everyone, right? So we're hoping to change the hearts and minds of, people and when they're looking at what they're putting on their plates, but also, changing the hearts and minds and providing the evidence for policy change, at the state level or at the federal level. There are very few protections for farmed animals in the United States. And I think if we could demonstrate that these animals are experiencing not just physical pain and suffering as a result of, being an animal in a factory farm, I think everyone knows that the animals they're eating have been killed and that process may have involved some suffering. And I think most of us, if we are meat eaters, we're trying to just kind of push that aside. But I think very few people are thinking about the emotional experience as well. And so, we know, like with this study with PTSD in particular, that PTSD is a condition that can be debilitating for people. And so if we find that farmed animals also experience, this debilitating condition as a result of what we are doing to them in order to get them onto our plates, I think that that's compelling evidence for why we should have more protections for animals, who are stuck in the system. In addition to, ideally, we could have more policies in place that are supporting a just, sustainable, plant-based food system. We want to shift a lot of the resources that are currently propping up animal agriculture because it's being propped up. There's a lot of subsidies that go into that. So let's shift all that money, those props, away from animal agriculture and towards this more sustainable, just plant-based food system that's really kind of building the good for everyone.
Okay, so how much does the need for consent by the animal affect participation rates? Meaning, are there enough animals in the experimental group who don't avoid humans to get meaningful data?
Yeah, this is a great question and one that we as a team are regularly grappling with. Thankfully, the way the study is designed, we can collect observational data through the behavior like Jenna demonstrated, regardless of whether somebody is avoidant of humans or not. and caregiver surveys as well. Those are that data that we can collect regardless of voluntary participation. It does become much more difficult with saliva collection. And in truth, we are still trialing those methods. We have successfully collected saliva from 3 of the 6 participants. But we are, those individuals were more inclined to be comfortable with humans. So we are in the process currently of another individual of seeing if she'll volunteer to spend some time with us to put a swab in her mouth. We're offering her lots of snacks and treats and goodies in order to encourage her to do so. But this certainly is a great question, and one that we are considering and trying to answer ourselves.
So there are so many questions, and I know we're so grateful for everybody's interest, and I wish we could get to them all, but we only have time for one more. And one that I've seen asked a couple different times by a couple different folks is like, how long is this study going to take? When are we going to see results? When is it going to end? And I know we've discussed it being in the infancy, but do we have any time projections that we'd like to discuss, and what that could look like in the future?
Wonderful question. It all depends on how many participants we are able to enroll in the study. So, for the first little bit year maybe of the study, we were relying solely on new residents coming in at Farm Sanctuary specifically. We've recently collaborated with 2 other sanctuaries. So Austin Farm Sanctuary and JP Farm Sanctuary are collaborators in this. And so honestly, the more collaborators that we can work with, the quicker the study will move, and the more quickly we will be able to publish results. So it doesn't fully answer the question because the reality is we don't know. But yeah, we would like to move it along quickly.
All right. Well, I think that's our time. I don't know if anybody wants to make some quick closing remarks, but I know I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk to everybody and to share what we're doing.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone so much for coming. We really do. We couldn't do this work without your financial support, without your interest, without your passion. I think, it just feels really good to know that there are so many people out there who care as much as we do about these, thinking, feeling individuals. And so we just feel really grateful to be able to share our work. Thank you for all the questions. We'll save these questions and take a look at them. And if there are any, that we weren't able to get to, that there was a lot of interest, we can figure out how to connect with you. And you also we would love for you to connect with us. If you have questions and you want to send an email, I can share my email in the chat. I will have our folks do that now. But thank you.
That concludes our webinar on PTSD. I hope you found it interesting and that there is information there that you'll be able to share with others and use to advocate on behalf of these other animals. Thank you so much for joining us, and please stay in touch.